Hello, hello. I am back with another book report for you. If you follow me on Substack Notes or on Blue Sky, you might have already had a little sneaky preview of this. This is a book that I picked up in a charity shop, I don't know, quite a while ago. It's been on my shelf of sort of atomic books. I'm kind of like a little magpie as far as interesting nuclear themed bits and pieces go, and I pick things up and I squirrel them away. Um, and yeah, I do have a lot of nuclear books, many of which I've already read, but I do also have a growing pile of ones that I've picked up, and that pile is kind of in eye shot of my desk. And this particular book sort of kept catching my eye, and a couple of weeks ago I thought, you know what, I'm going to read that. It's more than just a historical curiosity, I think. But I think, will see why I was drawn to it. Here it is, drum roll. It is called The Intelligent Woman's Guide to Atomic Radiation. Let's hold this up so you can really see this brilliant cover. Um, Published in 1964 by Penguin, and it's written by a very interesting lady called Margot Bennett. Now, obviously, this title begs many questions, doesn't it? The Intelligent Woman's Guide to Atomic Radiation. So obviously, that appealed to me. I'm an intelligent woman. I'm interested in atomic radiation. But what about the unintelligent woman? Who's going to write a book for her? And of course, the intelligent man. Well, presumably they already know all about atomic radiation. They don't need their own book. Who can say? But anyway, I will get back to talk a little bit more about some of this gender stuff at the end because it's quite interesting. But before I do that, I thought I'd just give you a bit more of a sort of context and background to the book. So it's part of this series called the Penguin Specials. These were published by Penguin from about the late 1930s through to, I think, the 80s. And they were basically sort of topical current affairs books, social and political sort of hot button issues of the day. And they were really aimed for a sort of mass market readership. And they were really popular. The first sort of wave of books starting in the late 1930s were obviously they were looking at, Hitler and Mussolini, the Jewish question, the rise of fascism. And they were super popular, and apparently they really helped keep Penguin going during the Second World War. And they then had a bit of a resurgence again. There was a whole new wave of them in the 60s, which obviously this book is part of, looking at themes around sort of the Cold War. But also there was a whole series. I have another book in this Penguin special series called Britain in the 60s, which were again looking at all different kind of policy issues. The one I've got is about education. And these were written by sort of academics, journalists, sometimes by sitting politicians of the day, and they were serious, they were in-depth, but they were aimed at a mass market reader, and they're really super interesting. And I found a really brilliant blog which I will link to in the notes. There's quite a few people collecting or trying to collect all these books, and it's really fascinating just to see some of the list of titles, so I will include that for you. And the other thing to say is this is quite a rare book I have discovered. So as I say, I bought it in a charity shop, and if you look in here, I think I paid about £10 for this. But when I popped it on Blue Sky, somebody replied to me saying he'd really been looking out for this book, and last time he'd seen it listed on eBay for £176. So it seems I got myself a bit of a bargain. So yeah, I'm working on the assumption that most of you probably not going to read this book because you haven't probably got £176 to drop on eBay. So I'm doing my little service for you to give you a little précis of what's in this book and what I think about it. But so let's first of all we'll talk a little bit about Margot Bennett. No relation to one of my favourite Substackers, Margaret Bennett. She writes Ninky Substack, so I'll link to her. Just a coincidence of name, but what a great namesake, because she's a really interesting lady, this Margot Bennett. So I'll read a little bit from the blurb about her. She says, Margot Bennett was born in Scotland and educated there and in Australia. She sold her first short stories before she left school, so instead of going to university, she chose to work on a New Zealand sheep station. For the next few years, she worked at various jobs in order to pay her way to other countries, New Guinea, Spain, France, Central Europe. She began to write after she was married and has written 10 books, 6 of them thrillers. She's written a great deal for television, several plays and many episodes in series, among them Maygrey. She's also written 2 films. She likes variety in writing and is now doing something in science fiction. Also mentions that she has 4 children, so she's a busy lady. But I found it even more kind of juicy biographical details about her on her Wikipedia page, which I'll also pop in the notes if you want to have a look at that. I think it mentions Spain. She was in Spain during the Civil War as a nurse. It's where she met her husband. And she was actually shot in the legs. She was shot twice while she was in an ambulance with a patient. Another interesting little tidbit about her was that she was, I believe, the second ever female screenwriter to be involved with Doctor Who, but for reasons that I guess are lost to history, she developed the story, but her episode never actually made it to screen, so probably a loss for Doctor Who fans. But yeah, she did write several novels, and one of them seems very interesting to me, and I looked it up. It is long since out of print, but it is available to borrow to read digitally on archive.org. Big up to archive.org, because it's a great source if you're looking for, especially for like hard to find out of print books and movies and things like that. Anyway, this novel she published in 1955 is called The Long Way Back, and it's basically set thousands of years into the future, after some sort of nuclear apocalypse event, which has basically sort of killed most of the world's sort of society. And the only place where life has survived in any meaningful way is on the continent of Africa, and they have developed a sort of completely new, technologically advanced civilizations. I think it's 7,000 years in the future. Anyway, word reaches them of this sort of like far away community country of savages, which is England. So they send a team of scientists and anthropologists out to meet these kind of savages, and so it's a sort of satire on colonialism, but also, you know, has themes of sort of nuclear annihilation and post-apocalyptic societies. So it just sounds super interesting. And so, yeah, if I do get around to reading that one, perhaps I'll pop on and do another video about that. But coming back to this particular book, so this is, as I say, it was published in 1964, and it's a very specific time in the history of kind of nuclear issues. Obviously, we're about 20 years out from the atomic bombs in Japan, and off the back of that, there's been sort of 2 decades really of the nuclear arms race, principally, obviously, United States and Soviet Union, but other countries getting the bomb too, Britain, France, China, and there's been a lot of nuclear testing. And with that, a lot of nuclear fallout, atmospheric fallout, and that is a big theme through this book. And a key point to mention is, again, timing-wise, 1964 is just a year after the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which basically banned atmospheric testing, although underground nuclear testing did carry on for another couple of decades after that. But fallout is something we sort of don't hear it talked about so much now, because, like, you know, testing has been banned now for over 30 years. But in the 1960s, it was a very live issue. And it's very much at the forefront of the book. And I think the sort of the prompt really perhaps for this book to be published. Other things to say in terms of civil nuclear power, the mid-60s is an interesting time because it's kind of the beginnings of the sort of bigger commercialization. So in America, I talked about this at some length in my film, which I should always take the opportunity to plug, The Atom, A Love Affair. You can catch it on Netflix or Disney Plus if you're in Europe, or if you go to theatomfilm.com, you can find out how to stream it on demand if you're somewhere else. Yeah, I looked at in my film. In the States, there was a bit, they called it like the gold rush, where all these companies were rushing in to build nuclear reactors in the 60s. Over here in Britain, 64 was the year, quite a decisive sort of turning point in terms of civil nuclear power, because up to that point we'd had this first generation of Magnox reactors, they were called, and that you might remember the sort of famous newsreel of the Queen at Calder Hall opening this first atomic power station. It was the first power station that put electricity into the grid, although it was actually primarily, it was a military reactor producing plutonium, but it did also make electricity. And so we then had a series of reactors that worked through the same principle. But by the mid-1960s, there was this plan to greatly expand nuclear power, and that is, again, as I'll come on to talk about, that's one of the assumptions that underpins this book. And it's a little bit in the weeds, but I found it really interesting when I was researching my film, so I'll just try and briefly talk about it here. There's this interesting moment in the mid-60s when it's kind of almost like, it strikes me as a bit of a sort of VHS Betamax, competition of technologies. So you had, the Americans had designed this design of reactor, the pressurized water reactor, the PWR, and that is the design of reactor that the French heavily went for. All their reactors that they built in the 70s were PWRs. But in the UK, we decided to go a different route, and we went for a domestic British designed reactor called the Advanced Gas-Cooled Reactor, which worked a slightly different way. And the AGR was, I think the British government hoped that it might open up sort of export markets, which it didn't. And it was really, as a program, it was kind of beset with a lot of problems. These reactors took a long time to build, and they went quite a bit over budget. So, unfortunately, a bit of a familiar story. But it's really interesting that she's writing this book sort of in the year that decision was taken, and so it was imagined that there was going to be this big expansion of the AGR. So to come to the book itself, as you can see, it's a pretty slim volume. It's about 150 pages, 7 chapters, and Margot does quite a good little summary at the beginning of kind of what she covers in the book. So she says, radiation plays a part in all our lives. To understand it, we have to begin with the invisible atom and the enormous power its nucleus contains. To treat it fairly, we must know something of its uses in peace as well as in preparations for war. We can't know how it affects us or our descendants without taking at least a cursory glance at biology and genetics. And the intelligent woman will obviously want to hear about pollution and protective measures. So yeah, that is a pretty good summation. So the first couple of chapters is very much the physical science of the atom, your proton, neutron, electron. She explains about ions and radiation, isotopes, and from that, how that then is able to create the fission reaction or the fusion reaction, and also what fallout actually is. Then there's a couple of chapters on the sort of the biology of radiation, so the genetics and impacts on reproductive system and down inherited defects and cancer. And then the last couple of chapters she sort of broadens out. So really, because most of the book is looking at radiation in terms of fallout, that is obviously primarily concerned with the nuclear bomb. But in the last couple of chapters, she broadens out to look at sort of other applications of atomic radiation, and then also as a brief chapter at the end on sort of pollution, again largely in terms of fallout. And so it's a pretty, it's a factual book. I found it actually very interesting and quite enjoyable to read. A good sort of little basic primer for, like, I'm a non-scientist. I mean, I suspect it's not the book you'd turn to in 2025 if you want a basic primer of nuclear radiation, because I suspect that our knowledge of the science has moved on somewhat. But I think it's pretty, on the basics, I think it's pretty good. And the other thing I'd say is that, like, she's a writer, she's a novelist. She does a nice little interesting turn of phrase at times. I've pulled out a couple of little phrases that I saw that I quite enjoyed, just to give you a flavour. So she's talking about positive and negative charges in an atom, and she says, this could be illustrated in human terms. A non-stop talker is attracted by an insatiable listener. But 2 non-stop talkers avoid each other, as do 2 insatiable but deprived listeners. And then talking about this, it's a sort of perennial question, isn't it? Would nuclear science have developed in the way that it did had World War II not happened when it did? And so she's talking about that, and she says, no one can tell you how long it would have taken nuclear fission to start its journey if war hadn't broken out in 1939. Mars is the only god with a big bank account. So in 1941, a team of brilliant scientists was collected in the United States. Mars was already there, writing out the checks. And then the other little piece I've picked out, again, she's talking about fallout. She says this was a new effect. Even the name was unknown, nor did it achieve instant fame. In 1945, fallout played only the minor role of third murderer. So she's got a nice little turn of phrase, and also there's a bit of a sort of sardonic sense to some of this, and it's a little interesting note I also saw in the biographical details on her Wikipedia page that she was quite left of centre politically, and she was a member of the campaign for nuclear disarmament. And I do think that she's very optimistic and positive about some of the other applications for radiation, which I'll talk about. But I think you can definitely sense, as what right-thinking person, really, nobody's in favour of nuclear war, but it's clear that she, has grave concerns about nuclear weapons. So as a primer, pretty interesting, enjoyable read. But obviously, I think for a modern reader, the biggest interest in this book is sort of as a snapshot of that particular time in the mid-1960s, and what we can see about the assumptions that were sort of baked in at that time, particularly about the future of nuclear power, and also interesting how she talks about, or more to the point, doesn't really talk about nuclear waste. So this is, I think it's 150 odd pages. There's a 17-page chapter on other applications of nuclear power, and of that, only I think 5 or 6 are on nuclear energy, and of that, like not quite one page, like 4 paragraphs is on nuclear waste, and it's interesting running through some of the other applications that she talks about of the atom, and some of them obviously are still very much the case today. So she talks about, you know, medical uses, radiology and radiography for diagnosis and for treatment, but also industrial applications. She talks about sterilization, and this was really interesting. I did not know anything about this, and I did a little bit of research. So she talks about this great new thing, and it was only just coming in the 60s, that instead of using steam to sterilize medical equipment, they'd begun to use gamma radiation. And she talks, again, it's very indicative of its time. She talks about how we've been able to use radiation on these plastic syringes that we throw away after one use, and there's been already 1 or 2 million syringes that have already been used. And she says this in this wonderful way of, isn't it wonderful? And obviously, as a modern reader, I read that and I thought, oh, you know, single-use plastic is this real like bogeyman for us now. So I had kind of assumed that we would have moved away from that, but actually, when I looked into it, the NHS now apparently uses about 150 million single-use throwaway plastic syringes every single year, and about somewhere approaching half of those are sterilised, not in hospitals but off-site, using radiation. So it's super interesting. She also talks about uses in agriculture and in transport. Obviously, nuclear submarines are a thing. Nuclear ships, and that was something else I remember in early cuts of my film. I had some great archive cartoons of ideas for, you know, nuclear, basically cruise ships and nuclear powered aeroplanes. Well, we know that those things didn't happen. So all of that is very fascinating. But obviously, I think the most interesting part, certainly for me with my interest, but also I think from the perspective of today, is what she says about nuclear power. And there are just some really interesting assumptions baked in there. So one is that we're going to have basically one new nuclear reactor every year for the next sort of 20 years and beyond that. And obviously we know that didn't happen. I mean, there were, from 1964, several more reactors did come on stream through the rest of the 60s, but they were this first generation of Magnox reactors. And then the AGRs, I think a couple came on stream in the 70s, but the rest didn't come on board, were not operating until the 80s. And then there was just one more, which we did eventually. Thatcher decided, after the sort of troubles with the AGR, she decided, when she had her sort of big plan of another new sort of generation of nuclear power, she did decide to go for the PWR, the pressurized water reactor that France had very successfully adopted. But Britain only managed to build one of those, which was Sizewell B, and that opened in 1995. And so that's, you know, that's very interesting. And the other thing is cost. I mean, she talks in 1960s, she's comparing obviously most heavily to coal. So she's talking about by 1970 that nuclear power could actually be breaking even or even cheaper than coal. Well, in fact, you know, the opposite happened. There was, you know, very big cost escalation through the 70s, and you know, it's still beset. Basically, the economic issues around nuclear power, I think, are probably still the biggest hurdle that industry faces in expanding. And we're at this interesting moment again right now where there's a big push for new nuclear power stations, and you know, we will see if they do end up being built. And then of course waste. So this is also really, really interesting, both in terms of she's sort of off on 2 counts with her thoughts about, or what her predictions, I suppose, her baked in assumptions about what will happen with nuclear waste. One is that that she just sort of assumes that it definitely will happen. So she says the present scheme is that all the long-lived radioisotopes should be fused in a kind of glass and then encased in steel. These tough containers will be stored in underground vaults or in the depths of disused mines. So that is your deep geological storage, which is, still the plan. But she just assumes that, she says, in 20 years' time, there'll be a lot of radioactive waste stored down these mines. By the year 2000, the guess is that the world as a whole will have radioactive waste equal to the fallout from 2 Hiroshima bombs to dispose of every day. So she's off, both in the fact that we just will have a storage facility by the year 2000. We're in 2025 and we're still nowhere closer. We don't even have a site confirmed to build this underground storage, this deep geological facility yet. But also on the scale she's imagining. So she says, she's talking about by the early 1970s, England alone will have 9 or 10 nuclear power stations, which I think is about broadly what it did. And there is a strong chance that from then on, all the new power stations built will be nuclear. The United States and Russia will certainly have far more nuclear reactors, and the whole of Western Europe will increasingly rely on nuclear power. So there's just this idea, which there was current at that time, that nuclear was going to basically sweep everything away and become the dominant source of energy. And, that just didn't happen. So it's really interesting to look back at this book from the perspective of now. It's not, well, there's the benefit of hindsight. They're just the viewpoint of further on in history. So basically, it's incredibly, really, really fascinating little kind of historical document. Also fun and enjoyable to read. But the last thing I wanted to just come back around to was the gender question, as the Intelligent Woman's Guide. And I don't think I could leave without just reading you a couple more paragraphs of this, which I just think these really date this book. Like, no publisher, I would imagine, would be writing things like this now. So on the back, on the blurb, she says, in the most real sense, women are more creative and less destructive than men. This Penguin special, which is so intimately concerned with life and inheritance, has therefore deliberately been called The Intelligent Woman's Guide to Atomic Radiation. It is, if you wish, a translation into plain English of ugly things that are normally referred to in the foreign language of science, because science is it's not ladylike, is it? It's men's world, and of course this like binary dichotomy of women and life and creation, and men and destruction and technology. And actually she sort of delves into that, it goes into that even further in her in the introduction, when she talks about fallout, because fundamentally this book, as I say, it is fallout, and the long-lived radioisotopes in the atmosphere is the main thrust of why she's written this book. And she says about fallout, it's one of the big black magic words of our age. It carries a suggestion of malevolence, of a danger that is intangible and invisible, and as selective as a witch doctor's pointing finger. One of the purposes of this book is to bring it into perspective. Fallout has caused a certain pollution, a very thin scattering of contamination in some of the food we eat. This is one of the reasons why the book is addressed more to women than to men. Men and women are equal in most respects, but the mother is far more intimately concerned with the health of the family than the father. It is the mother who sees that the children have green vegetables and milk, and who nurses them when they have measles. A woman has a relationship with a small baby that even the best of fathers can't approach. Although she very often runs a career as well, the family is the woman's business. If she has no family, she still has a tenderness for children that is different in quality from the feelings of a man. I mean, this really locates this book in the 1960s, doesn't it? This is pre-women's liberation, and it is it's just an interesting reminder. I mean, I think today the discussions that we hear discussions about, there's not enough women working in the nuclear industry. It is, I think, true to say that it was something I got very interested in my film about who supports nuclear and who is not into nuclear. That has characteristically and sort of stereotypically fallen largely along gender lines. So there's not nothing in it, but just the whole tenor of that approach. And it would be very interesting to know if such a book of such a title could ever be published today, which I'm not sure it could, but if it was, I think it would be quite different in tone. So anyway, that's just some final thoughts. So all in all, this was a very interesting and kind of fun, quick little book to read, a little glimpse into mid-1960s politics in Britain, and just a journey inside the atom, really. So yeah, The Intelligent Woman's Guide to Atomic Radiation. I enjoyed it. You'll probably not going to read it, I'm guessing, but if you do, or if you have read it, I'd be very interested to know what you thought of it. And yeah, I will be back with more book reports for you very, very soon. Thanks, guys. Till the next time. Bye.